I'm very happy to be here. Of course, I've known Professor Srinivasan since a long time. I don't know if he remembers, but I first met him in Professor Narasimha's room. It was, I think, 1980 or so. And one thing I can say, he has not changed. And of course, he's been very encouraging, and I've learned a lot from him, whether he knows it or not, but through conversations at different times. Today I'll talk about turbulent free convection. So free convection is basically buoyancy-driven flows. And I'll concentrate on two types of convection. One is what is called Rayleigh Bernard Convection, and the other is less well-known, which is tube convection. And some of the basic material is from a chapter I had written on in the Environmental Fluid Dynamics Handbook. And I guess most of you are familiar that you get convection in a lot of different environments, including the Earth's atmosphere, in the Earth's mantle, in the sun, etc. And most of these flows are at high Rayleigh numbers, and most of them would be turbulent. So a lot of people have worked in this, including a lot of PhD students. So just as an introduction to heat transfer, if you have conduction, of course, the heat flux is just related to the gradient of the temperature. And when you have convection, the heat flux at the surface is directly related to the gradient at the surface itself. And the main problem in all convective heat transfer is to determine this heat transfer coefficient. That is, flux is proportional to the temperature difference. And so you need to find out this h, and this h itself could be a function of the temperature difference itself. And what I'm going to be talking about is free convection, that is flow created by buoyancy differences. And classic example of that would be a horizontal plate which is warmer than the ambient. And typically you'll get a plume like this, so you'll get boundary layers starting at the edge, and then you'll get eventually a plume, which is in contrast to forced convection, where the flow is created by an external agency like the wind. And then the flow itself, which is externally created, determines the heat transfer. And free convection are roughly categorized into ones which are created by vertical surfaces, which are more easier to understand. For example, if you have a vertical plate which is heated, you get a boundary layer which rises along the plate. And similarly, if you have a slot like this, with a temperature difference created between these two vertical surfaces, you'll get convection with fluid rising on the warmer side and falling in the colder side. But more complicated are those flows which are created on horizontal surfaces which are have some sort of temperature difference. So the classic example is Rayleigh Bernard Convection, where you have a temperature difference between the lower plate and the top plate. And when the convection is turbulent, typically you have several structures which I will show later. But roughly you have some sort of dynamic or plumes close to the wall, to both the walls, and then you have an outer flow. And you can define a conduction layer thickness based on the gradient of temperature at the wall. And because of convection, you typically have a core where the temperature is almost constant. It's isothermal. And as I showed earlier, again, you have convection on a horizontal surface here. And I will try to show you that there is hardly any difference between convection in Rayleigh Bernard type and convection over a horizontal plate like this. And in particular, the near wall structure is identical. And this is what I call tube convection, which is less well known. And so you have two tanks which are separated by a long tube. So here you maintain a higher density, and here you have a lower density, so it's unstably stratified. And so it's an exchange flow, and if the Rayleigh number is high enough, then you get a turbulent convection in this region, and since the tube is tall enough, you get axially homogeneous convection there. So this, it's very easy to create turbulent convection. This is a Schlerin picture of a person sitting, breathing and in a colder environment, and the flow around her is clearly turbulent. And of course, if you were to take either a velocity or a temperature reading anywhere, you'd get almost random fluctuations. So as probably all of you know that most flows around us are turbulent, and one of the reasons is because you get typically very high Rayleigh numbers with air and water. That's the most common fluids we encounter. And most times we break up the velocity field and other fields into average quantity and a fluctuating one. And you get these correlations which dictate, in some sense, the Reynolds stress or the heat flux or whatever. And these are the equations, continuity equation for incompressible flow. And this would be the momentum equation with the Boussinesq approximation. So you get a buoyancy force in the vertical direction. And that's the only place where you get this density difference. Otherwise, the flow is assumed to be incompressible. And once you Reynolds average it, of course, you get this type of equation in the vertical direction. So you have a turbulent stress if you have shear, and the buoyancy force. And the heat flux is, you can break it up into two parts. One is the conduction. So it is what you would get in laminar flow. That is the conductivity into the gradient of temperature. And the other one is the turbulent flux, which is a correlation between the vertical velocity fluctuation and the temperature fluctuation. So for example, in Rayleigh Bernard convection, in the core, all the heat flux would be due to this term alone. And if one were to look at the budget for turbulent kinetic energy, you see two types of production terms. One is due to buoyancy, and the other is due to shear. And of course, you have dissipation, which kills the turbulent kinetic energy. And I will show that in tube convection, the only production of turbulence is due to the buoyancy production. And the non-dimensional parameters in convection are the Rayleigh number, which is typically the density difference into reference length cube divided by kinematic viscosity into thermal diffusivity, or diffusivity of species if it happens to be, if the convection is caused by species. And the other non-dimensional parameter is, of course, Prandtl number, which is ratio of momentum diffusion to thermal or species diffusion. So in the experiments I'm going to be talking about, we have Prandtl number of the order of 7 if it is using heat in water. And also we use salt to create the density difference, in which case the Prandtl number, the Schmidt number is of the order of 6 to 700. So in Rayleigh Bernard convection, as you increase the Rayleigh number. And you can think of changing the Rayleigh number by looking at this example, where you have two plates, where the temperature difference is the same, and you keep increasing the distance between the plates. And so initially you get pure conduction, and then instability sets in at a Rayleigh number of about 1708, and after that you get convection up to some point. And further increase in Rayleigh number, you get unsteady convection or rolls. And finally, when the Rayleigh number is of the order of 10 power 7 or so, you get fully turbulent convection. And as I mentioned earlier, it is dominated by plumes near the wall and isothermal core. And the non-dimensional heat flux typically is given in the form of Nusselt number, which is the ratio of the heat flux you get in the turbulent convection divided by the heat flux you would get if there was no convection, if it was pure conduction. So it basically gives you a ratio of how much enhancement there is of heat flux due to convection. And the Nusselt number would depend on, of course, the Rayleigh number and Prandtl number and the geometrical parameters. For example, the aspect ratio in the case of Rayleigh Bernard Convection. So I'll be talking about two types of scaling. So one is where the Nusselt number goes like Ra to the power of 1/3. And then one can immediately work out and show that the heat flux is independent of the length scale, which means that if you double the length scale and if the convection is turbulent, the heat flux does not change. And this is what we find in Rayleigh Bernard Convection, where it is very close to Ra to the power of 1/3. And the other type of scaling is where the Nusselt number goes like Ra to the power of half into Pr to the power of half, or if the convection is due to concentration difference, then it would be Ra to the power of half into Schmidt number to the power of half. And this type of scaling implies that the flux is independent of the viscosity and diffusivity. So these are the two extreme ends of scaling one finds in turbulent convection. And some of the pictures I'll be showing are based on this type of flow visualization technique, where you have a laser sheet, that is, you have a laser beam, you pass it through a cylindrical lens. So that cylindrical lens creates a laser sheet light, and you pass it through the test section, and the test section, the fluid will contain fluorescent dye. So basically the visualization is in that plane. And this is a very common way of visualizing the flow, which gives you the structure in that plane. So this is a cartoon of Rayleigh Bernard Convection. And as I mentioned, you get close to the wall, of course, it is pure conduction or diffusion. And then you get plumes which mix with the outer flow. So if you have an aspect ratio 1 cell, you'll have a single roll. And if you have a larger aspect ratio, you'll get many, many rolls. So in turbulent boundary layers, typically you talk about outer flow and inner flow. But in convection, for some reason, that type of distinction is not really made. And one can really talk about inner flow and outer flow here also. So if you look at the inner scaling, that is for the velocity, for the temperature difference, and for the length scale. So this type of scaling was first proposed by Townsend, and it is based on the heat flux. And but many times the heat flux itself is not known. So what is known is the temperature difference. So an alternate way to derive scalings is to base it on the temperature difference. So TW is the temperature difference, for example, between the wall and the ambient. So you can get two types of near wall scalings. And the outer scaling was proposed by Deardoff, which is based on the larger length scales. So if you were to look at a cross section of the convection, and this is a membrane, and what we have is salt water on the top and fresh water on the bottom, and we have a laser sheet, vertical laser sheet, and the fluorescent dye has been put in the bottom tank. So what you see here are plumes which are rising through this membrane, and the membrane pores are fine enough that it is pure diffusion. So this is an easy way of creating high Rayleigh number, high Prandtl number convection. So typically to increase the Prandtl number, what one does is to increase the viscosity. But here we reduce the diffusivity, which means the Rayleigh number also increases and you get high Prandtl number as well. And so this is exactly what you would see. The type of convection here is exactly like what you would have on a heated surface, except the Prandtl number is much higher. So I will just play this movie. So you see that you get many plumes here, and finally you get the plumes rising away from the away from the plate. And if you were to look at the view just above this membrane or just above the wall, this is what you would see. So it looks very nice. So what you see are these bright lines are those places where the plumes are rising. So it's essentially like the hot fluid is rising along these plumes. And you can see that the structure is quite complicated. And in some sense, this is the coherent structures for turbulent convection next to a horizontal wall, much like the sublayer vortices you have in a turbulent boundary layer. And of course, since the flow is turbulent, so there is constant action. So the plumes are constantly moving about randomly, and most of the times two plumes come close together and merge, and fresh plumes are born in those empty spaces. And one can think of these plumes as basically being due to an instability. So you have a thin, unstable layer next to the wall. And the result of that instability is basically the formation of these plumes. And it is much like if you have a horizontal surface below which you have a layer of water, and the drops which you see are essentially a result of instability. And the plumes are very much like that. So there is a famous model called Howard's model for turbulent convection, which was proposed quite some time back. And the reason, I mean, the model is basically an unsteady model where with time, conduction layer grows. And when the conduction layer thickness becomes unstable, or the Rayleigh number based on this conduction layer thickness exceeds a certain value, it breaks up into a thermal. And one can do calculations, for example, what is the heat flux based on this very simple model. But however, in many experiments, what you find is not thermals, but line plumes. So we came up with essentially a spatial equivalent of Howard's model, in the sense that, again, it's an instability, but it is, you have these, if you take the cross section, you have these line plumes like this. So the boundary layer you can think of, it grows in space, And at this point, when the Rayleigh number based on this local boundary layer thickness exceeds the critical value, you get a plume. And based on this type of argument, we had come up, actually this should be Ra lambda to the power of 1/3, that the length scale of the plume, that is the Rayleigh number based on the plume spacing to the power of 1/3, is almost constant, around 50, for Prandtl number of 1, and it is slightly higher if the Prandtl number is larger. And if you were to look at this coherent structure or the plume, it would look something like this. Okay, so you have the streamlines. So the ambient fluid comes in close to the wall, it gets heated, and then the plume rises like this. And these are the isotherms. So essentially, if you look at how heat is transferred, so at the wall, it will be purely conductive, and it becomes very close to zero somewhere here, and it's taken over by the convective part. That is, here it is pure conduction, and here most of the heat is carried away because of the plumes rising. And this is typically what you see in any turbulent flow. For example, if you look at the turbulent Reynolds stress near a wall, that's what you would see. So here you would get diffusive momentum transfer, and it would be very soon taken over by the convective or the turbulent. And this is Z by ZW, and ZW is what I mentioned earlier, is the near wall length scale based on the temperature difference. And the model agrees quite well with experiments. So this is the plume spacing in centimeters for water, and this is the model. And these are data from experiments taken from different sources. And one can also, just based on these calculations, get the fluctuations of the mean temperature, the fluctuations of temperature, and also the fluctuations in the velocity. And so you can see the mean temperature is reasonably well predicted, and so is the temperature fluctuations. So these are near wall variations, basically. So this is Z by ZW. So in for around Z by ZW of about 10 or 20, you get all the drop in temperature, essentially. And the vertical velocities are also well predicted. But of course, the horizontal velocities are not predicted well at all, because this is a stationary plume. And as we had seen earlier, the plumes are moving around all the time. One of the questions is what happens to the near wall flow as you increase the Rayleigh number. And one thing which happens as you increase the Rayleigh number is the outer flow becomes stronger and stronger. So if you have a aspect ratio 1 cell, you have a single roll, and as you keep increasing the height, the strength of that roll keeps increasing. So one important question which people have been asking is, what does the outer wind or the outer flow do? So one of the things is it aligns the plumes, but importantly, the heat flux is not much affected at all. And that is the reason why you get that Ra to the power of 1/3 scaling. And in fact, the near wall plume structure is a signature of the outer flow. So this is the near wall structure in an experiment. And you can see these plumes are aligned along this direction. And if you were to look at how the outer flow behaves, it will be something like this. So basically the flow is impinging here, and it is the plumes are being aligned because of this outer flow, and then it rises. And if you have two rolls like this, then again you can see they're aligned in this direction. And this is near the wall, and as you go away from the wall, you see that you're capturing this part of the fluid which is coming between these two rolls. So what I was mentioning was that basically looking at this near wall structure, it gives you an idea of how the outer rolls look like, or the outer flow looks like. So similarly here, this is a more complicated view, where you have these types of structures which are impinging on the surface, and these are reflected on the flow near the wall itself. So this is an interesting example. In fact, this experiment was done by Sparrow a long time ago. And this is convection over an isolated horizontal plate. And in fact, it tells a lot of things about turbulent convection. So you have this plate So near the edge of the plate, you have this free convection boundary layer. And you can see that near the edge here, all the plumes are aligned. And that is because of this outer flow here. And it becomes unstable at some point here. And the inner region here is essentially like what you would get in regular turbulent Rayleigh Bernard convection. And this is a picture taken in Rayleigh Bernard convection. And again, you can see these plumes. And the outer wall, so the outer flow would be aligned like this. The plumes are getting aligned because of the outer flow, and the outer flow would be in this direction. And this is the basic message, that the near wall flow on any horizontal convection would be composed of these line plumes with a typical spacing of about 50 wall units. So that is like what you would say in turbulent boundary layers, it will be like 100 wall units, of course. And the type of structures there are very different. And similarly, the same type of structures you would get on a horizontal isolated plate as well. And the outer flow, of course, as I mentioned earlier, could align the plumes in certain directions, but the heat transfer rate or the heat flux itself is largely unchanged. So this is what I just mentioned. And the fact that the heat flux goes like Ra to the power of 1/3 is reflected here. But just taking a correlation and using air as an example, if you look at the watts per meter squared, the heat flux, as you change the height between the height of the cell, you can see beyond of about a few centimeters, the heat flux is almost independent of the dimension. So that's what I was mentioning. That is, this is like 1 meter and this is like 10 meters. And so instead of Nusselt number, there is a better way to non-dimensionalize the heat flux. And that is basically based on so near the wall you have this type of gradient, and you can get a conduction layer thickness by just extrapolating. And if you write down the Rayleigh number based on the conduction layer thickness and raise it to the power of -1/3, that is essentially proportional to the heat flux. So this is an alternate way of non-dimensionalizing the heat flux. And this is very much like what you do in forced convection, where you use CF for the skin friction coefficient. And many people would know that the skin friction coefficient doesn't vary much in, for example, a turbulent boundary layer or a turbulent pipe flow. So similarly here, if you write the heat flux in this form, the non-dimensional heat flux, for a wide range of Rayleigh numbers, you can see that most of the Ra delta t to the power of -1/3 is roughly between 0.15 and 0.2. Whereas the variation in the Nusselt number varies by orders of magnitude. So this is a much more physical and a much better way to non-dimensionalize heat flux than Nusselt number. And in fact, if you look at Ra delta T to the power of minus 1/3 for a variety of different turbulent free convection flows, you can see that they all lie in the same ballpark. Okay, so this is finite horizontal plate convection driven by evaporative cooling, vertical plate, vertical cavity. So, and it's surprising that it's all in that around that number, even though the dynamics would be, of course, very different. And one of the things which people have been looking at, in fact, including Professor Srinivasan, is what happens to the heat flux at very high Rayleigh numbers. And of course, people, Kreikman had predicted that you would go to this ultimate regime, what is called ultimate regime now. That is, you get Nusselt number scaling like Ra to the power of half. And in the experiment so far, it's still controversial whether that regime has been reached at all. And I mean, this basic question is, something should happen as we keep increasing the Rayleigh number. The point is, when does that change occur? And that change would occur because if you imagine, if you go to very high Rayleigh numbers and the outer flow becomes more and more strong, then you'll go to a regime where the outer flow is driven by free convection, but the inner flow would be like forced convection. And so this brings us to the other type of flow, which is axially homogeneous turbulent convection in a long vertical tube. And this work was started when I spent a few months in Mexico, and we wanted to do something very quickly. And it was first published in Current Science in 2000. So I'd earlier shown you the turbulent kinetic energy as having two components. One is shear and the other is buoyancy. So in tube convection, I'll show that the shear is totally absent. And so all the turbulent production is entirely due to buoyancy. So it's a purely buoyancy-driven turbulent flow. And to understand what this flow looks like, a very simple example would be if you place a heater in the ambient, you'll get a plume like this. Now if you place the same heater in a tube which is closed at the bottom, the hot air would rise, but unlike here where the cold air can come from the sides, here the cold air has to come from the top. So basically you get a situation where you have rising warm air and falling cold air simultaneously, and the volume flow rate across this cross section has to be 0. And of course, we do the experiments by connecting two tanks. And as I mentioned, it will have 0 mean flow. And it is axially homogeneous because the tube is tall enough. And it's very similar to the turbulent fully developed pipe flow you get. So in turbulent fully developed pipe flow, it is driven by a linear pressure gradient. Here it is driven by a linear density gradient. And as I mentioned, the turbulent energy production is solely by buoyancy. And you can create this density difference by either using salt or heat. And one of the advantages of using salt is that you get a pure adiabatic boundary condition on the wall very easily. Otherwise, if you use heat, then it has to be insulated. And here it makes sense to define the Rayleigh number based on the density gradient rather than the density difference itself, because it is homogeneous, axially homogeneous. And of course, the other parameter is the diameter and thermal diffusivity and viscosity. And so this shows the experimental setup for the experiments using salt. So the tube diameter is about 6 inches, and the height is about 1.5 meters. So I forgot to mention that so in the homogeneous, away from the ends, you get linear temperature gradient or linear density gradient, and this end effect or entrance effect lasts for about a diameter or so. So away from the ends, about 1 or 2 diameters away from the entrance, it is homogeneous. And the experiments are done by initially having salt water here and fresh water here, and the stopper which is removed. And removal of the stopper starts the experiment. And the experiment runs for several hours. So at each point in time, it can be considered to be quasi-steady. And so you get in one experiment a range of Rayleigh numbers. And based on just measuring the concentration difference, you can get the flux as well as the density difference. And we did experiments with heat also, and with different tube diameters and tube lengths, but all of them with an L by D ratio of about 10, such that you got axially homogeneous flow in the center. And of course, it had to be insulated. And if you look at the temperature gradient, you can see it is linear. But this is not conduction. It is turbulent convection, but the temperature gradient is, of course, linear because it's axially homogeneous. And so originally we had done experiments with different tube diameters, and many of these features are still not fully explored. So if the tube diameter is small enough or the Rayleigh number is small enough, you get half and half flow. That is, one stream of the warm fluid rises in one half, the other half it falls. And slight increase in Rayleigh number, you get some sort of helical instability, which has, as I said, not really been studied. And further increase in Rayleigh number, you get three-dimensional type of flow. And of course, at high enough Rayleigh number, the flow becomes fully turbulent. And so this is a laser-induced fluorescence picture. Fluorescent dye is added in the top tank, and so this is the central portion of the tube. So this is how the flow looks like. You can see that it is highly complicated, and it is indeed axially homogeneous, but you get large number of scales. And if you were to take a shadowgraph picture of the same flow, this is with salt, so the gradients are very large, and you can see that it's a very fine structure. And again, it shows that it is essentially homogeneous. And in fact, we looked at, this is basically light propagation through a turbulent medium. And in fact, we looked at the spectra of these things, of the intensity field. And we were able to get the spectra and try to see what people have, how it relates to what people have done in the atmosphere. So in the laboratory, it's almost entire cross-section. So you get a random homogeneous field. And if you were to look at the instantaneous velocity field, it will look something like this, without any mean flow or any flow structure as such. And the velocity profiles, the mean velocity is 0. The mean Reynolds shear stress is 0. And this is the vertical velocity fluctuations. And this is the lateral velocity fluctuations. So the lateral velocity fluctuations die out much faster because of the kinematic blocking effect of the walls. And of course, the velocity fluctuations have to be zero at the wall. And so this is essentially like a fluctuating turbulent velocity field next to a wall. And if you were to do experiments at different Rayleigh numbers, you get similar profiles, but they're not exactly the same. So there is still a Rayleigh number effect. And if you were to look at the time history of the fluctuations, they would look something like this. Near the wall, the vertical fluctuations are still large, whereas the horizontal ones have nearly died. And one can do a simple mixing length theory for this based on the density gradient. And you get scales for the velocity and the fluctuations in density, from which you can get a scaling for the flux. And if you were to calculate the Nusselt number based on this, then of course you get this Ra to the power of half, Prandtl number to the power of half scaling for Nusselt number. And Reynolds number goes like Ra to the power of half and Prandtl number to the power of minus half. And this is what is predicted as the ultimate scaling. And if from the flow visualization, what you see is eddies of the order of the diameter of the pipe, which are either falling or rising, and often you get these collision events. And near the wall, it's kind of interesting flow because you have a sustained turbulent flow next to a wall. And a lot of people have studied turbulent flow next to a wall, but those are in wind tunnels where you have a grid turbulence and that turbulence would die. But here you have turbulence which is sustained. And you get all these splat and anti-splat events which people have observed. So this is Nusselt number and Reynolds number scalings. And we get that Ra to the power of half scaling quite easily. And these were some of the earlier experiments, and these are the recent ones. And you can see for a range of Rayleigh numbers, you get this Ra to the power of half scaling. And one of the important things about tube convection is that you get extremely high fluxes of heat or salt compared to Rayleigh Bernard convection. So the turbulence is much, much stronger in tube convection compared to Rayleigh Bernard convection. So it's a good candidate for fundamental studies in turbulent free convection. And when we did experiments with heat, we discovered another regime. And so this is Nusselt number versus Ra into PR. We saw that above a certain Rayleigh number, it shows that Ra to the power of half scaling. But below this Rayleigh number here, it goes to a separate or a different scaling, which is more like Ra to the power of 0.3, which is what is obtained in Rayleigh Bernard convection. But it's not quite the same because it is Ra into PR to the power of 0.3. And when we looked at data from different sources, so there's not been too much work on this. So there is one DNS study done by Losey's group. And we did the experiments with heat, and these are the experiments with salt. And all those show deviations at different RAPR values away from the Ra to the power of half scaling. So there is some sort of transition happening, but at different Ra into PR values. But however, if you rescale it and you write Nusselt number divided by Prandtl number versus Grashof number, you can see that the transition happens at the same Grashof number. And that is explained by looking at the scaling. I mean, finally what this means, when you go away from Ra to the power of half scaling, it means that viscosity is becoming important. And that viscosity becomes important because of the near wall fluctuations. So here the viscosity is important, and we saw that you get a peak like this, and the boundary layer thickness near the wall due to this fluctuating velocity would go like square root of viscosity times some time scale. So at small enough Rayleigh number or Grashof number, this boundary layer thickness becomes of the same order, or it starts becoming important in the sense that it could become like 0.2 or 0.3 times the diameter. And that's when you see this transition. So basically, the viscous effects start getting important, and that's when you start seeing the transition. And I'll very quickly go through this kinetic energy and scalar spectra. So one of the important questions is how does buoyancy affect the kinetic energy spectra and the scalar spectra? Because according to Kolmogorov's theory, you get k to the power of -5/3, where the energy is injected at the highest scale, largest scales. But in buoyancy-driven flows, you can have, in principle, energy being injected at different scales, because it is these buoyant blobs of fluid which will have different scales. And in principle, you can have energy injected. And so whether that k to the power of -5/3 law still holds or not. And since our experimental setup was quite big and the Rayleigh numbers were quite high, we thought we could get some idea of how buoyancy affects the spectra. So you have this Kolmogorov scaling k to the power of -5/3, and there is another scaling which people have proposed, or Bolzano and Obukov have proposed, where buoyancy starts affecting. And this theory was proposed for stably stratified flows. Whether this holds for unstably stratified flows is an open question. And there you get k to the power of -11/5, and for scalar it would be k to the power of -7/5. And similarly, one can derive these relations for the second order structure functions. And what we found was that for the lateral velocity, you get very close to k to the power of -5/3, both for the spectra as well as for the structure functions. That is, it's Kolmogorov type. And for the vertical velocity fluctuations, it is even better. And we did the scalar spectra from the PLIF images. And of course, it was a little more complicated than we originally thought, because it has to be density matched, otherwise the beams will steer and you won't get a good concentration measurement. And here it seemed like that it's closer to Bolzano. So it's a little bit puzzling why for the kinetic energy it is like Kolmogorov, and why for the scalar it is closer to Bolzano. And similarly for the spatial spectra. I think I will end here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir, for the nice talk. I wanted to ask that in carrying out your experiments for the Rayleigh Bernard Convection, using the salt, and when you are accordingly fine-tuning the parameters for a particular Rayleigh number, isn't it possible that the concentration itself will become an active scalar, and I will get the physics which actually I don't want? I mean, I'm actually studying some other problem instead of studying the simple Rayleigh Bernard convection.
No, it is active scalar only, because the salt concentration difference is the one which is creating the flow. That's what we want. But what is important is that the membrane pore size be small enough that you get pure diffusion across the membrane. So we did some experiments where the pore size was larger, in which case there was a convection or advection through the membrane itself. So that's what you should avoid if you want to study pure Rayleigh Bernard type convection. But otherwise, yeah, the salt is the one which is causing the flow.
Okay. And another thing I wanted to ask is, do you have an opinion on the extension of this spatial Howard's model for studying very high turbulent Rayleigh Bernard convection?
Well, this is the quite high turbulent Rayleigh Bernard convection, and all the simulations do show that you get these line plumes.
Okay.
Any further question?
Size of the outer rolls. So the size of the outer rolls is essentially determined by the height of your cell. So if it is a aspect ratio 1 cell, then you get a single roll. But if it is aspect ratio larger, then you'll get multiple rolls, which would, the lateral extent of these rolls would be of the same size as the height.
Yeah, I just want to remark that from the flux, energy flux arguments, one can, we discussed that, rule out the Boussinesq scaling for Rayleigh Bernard, because buoyancy feeds energy into the kinetic energy.
Yeah, in fact, I forgot to mention that you have a theory for why it should be Kolmogorov. But the scalar one is still a little bit.
So I just want to make another remark that experiments, since I think it's a 2D PIV, unless we get full 3D picture, it may not be able to give you the full, the predicted value. So that could be the issue.
Well, it is a slice of the velocity field. You're talking about the aliasing effect and things like that, or?
So there's a perpendicular to the velocity field, there's a Uy.
Yes.
And that should also contribute. When we say a spectrum, it's combination of all the three components.
But all measurements of spectra would be, I mean, with.
That's why, according to what I believe is, experiments is very hard to
use
the spectrum because we can't apply Taylor hypothesis.
Right.
And the probes are limited, either point probe or a PIV.
Yeah, in fact, I forgot to mention that Taylor's hypothesis will not work here because the mean flow itself is 0. So what is the relationship between spatial and temporal spectra is, and again, I think you've been looking at that problem as well.
You have showed the changes of the scaling exponent from 1/3 to the half. So in that transition range, do you see any change in the mean flow structure?
Mean flow, actually we haven't done velocity measurements at the lower range of, below that transition. Actually, most of the measurements have been at the RA to the power of half regime. So that is one of the things we need to do. But some preliminary measurements seem to show that the velocity, the fluctuating profiles look sort of similar. Yeah, the data seem to show that. I mean, of course, there will be some transition regime, but